So this article is one that I often use as an example of a very well written IMRAD report. And I like it for both because it's well written and because it's relatively easy to understand, even though it's on a technical topic. It's something that we can all relate to. So I want to walk you through it and explain what is working in each of these sections. First, the title seems appropriate, seems to capture the essence of what this is. I don't have much to say about the title, so let's move to the abstract. Now, the first thing you might notice about the abstract is it's a little bit on the long side. Most abstracts are 200 to 250 words. This one I counted comes in at 254, so just a little bit long. I actually prefer the length if the writer doesn't have a strict word count. It is also slightly unusual to have multiple paragraphs in an abstract, though again, I actually like this if there's no rules against it. So how does this play out? First paragraph here is the introduction. It introduces the research question that they're going to use properties of passwords for high value accounts. Notice that the authors have very concisely gotten the novelty moves, the first three of those novelty moves, into just 2 sentences. So there's been considerable research that suggests significance, and then they define the status quo, which is also a gap. The status quo and gap is that existing studies are limited, and so we don't understand. And then the next sentence is very clearly filling the gap, and they even nicely use this language here. Now, all of this text currently highlighted, I would describe as their methods. This is a little more space than we might typically give to the methods, but it's important in this case because one of their key contributions is actually their methodology, is actually how they got all of these passwords. And they signal that right here. Key aspects rely on our indirect access to plain text passwords. Then the rest of this paragraph is dedicated to results. We know that these are results because of some of the key words we discover, and correlations. If they are reporting correlations, that's almost always a result. We find is definitely results language. In addition, we find. So they're reporting their findings. Then in the last paragraph, I would characterize this first sentence as going back to method, explaining another key part of their method, and then the rest of this focused on findings or results. So this has some variation on, it doesn't go straight through the IMRAD, but it is very easy to tell what they're doing at different points. And we do have some substantial discussion of the results. What we don't have is a discussion about what to do next. That's not that unusual. Sometimes that will be in the abstract, sometimes it isn't. Overall, I think this is a very well-written abstract that could be used as a model. It is very clear to understand what is going on, and it gives us a very high-level overview of this study. Now let's take a look at the introduction, and I've zoomed out here so we can just see how long it goes. We see that the introduction is about 5, maybe 6 paragraphs, and then we move into related work. This is the literature review section. And then data collection is where they move into their methods. Now, this introduction also very nicely follows the novelty moves. And the first paragraph is devoted to significance. So some key significance phrases are researchers have been doing this for decades, and this indicates why it is important. The research community has invested significant effort. And better understanding of text passwords therefore remains important. So these are keywords that are really saying, hey, we need to study this. Now this is also pointing out some status quo and gaps, but I think the main focus, the main rhetorical purpose of this paragraph is to talk about significance. Then we move into status quo. So describing some of the studies, and if you counted this first sentence as significance, too, that's fine. What I want us to agree on, though, is that when we get to prior password studies, we are clearly in the realm of status quo and talking about gaps, because we're focused on drawbacks here. And then the very last sentence is really a clear statement of the gap, because whether the results apply to real high-value passwords has remained open. So this sentence tells me, because of the way they're describing the gap, that this study is going to look at real high-value passwords. And then notice how in the next paragraph they move to filling the gap. So in this paper we do this. That's a clear filling the gap move. So the fact that it's the entire user base of this university says that it's real, and these are high value gatekeeper. So these are real, high value, and it explains what they are. Now, the rest of this paragraph explains their methods a little bit. That's unusual to have this much discussion of the methods, or really any discussion of the methods at all in the introduction. But here, because the methodology and how they got access to these passwords is such a key part of their contribution in the paper, it makes sense. In general, when you're working with writers in the GCC and you see something that's unusual, ask them, say, that seems unusual, why did you include it here? See if they have a good reason, or if it's that they didn't know. If it's a good reason, go ahead and say, okay, that's a good rationale. I'm gonna let you know that's a little unusual, but I think you have a good reason for doing it. Let the writer make the choice. In other words, we don't have to fix everything for them, but what we do want to do is make sure that they're aware that they're making a choice here, that they're not doing this out of ignorance of what the genre conventions are, and that they're aware that it is somewhat unusual. Now, in the next paragraph, they are previewing their results. Sometimes writers do this in the introduction, sometimes they don't. My personal preference is that they not preview results in the introduction, but that's really a personal preference, and it's whatever is typical in their field, or what the writer feels like doing. My preference is that the preview of results not be in there, because I really like the introduction just to focus on the research question. But we also see that the way that they're previewing the results is really focused on the novelty, two important and novel contributions. It is not at all unusual for writers to use the language of the novelty moves in writing their introductions. So we're focused on findings. We can tell here with keywords like find. So the rest of this paragraph is focused on findings, and even here we're starting to move into discussion where they are putting their results in context with what other researchers have found. We confirm this finding, and they're getting into some things that we could see how we might apply them. Uppercase letters are least effective, placed at the beginning. Then they go and they explain their next main contribution and some of the findings here. And they end with implications, so discussion. So what this introduction in this particular article is doing is really kind of an expanded version of the abstract. Taking the novelty moves, going into more depth, going into some more depth about the methods and results, and particularly the implications. So in summary, While this introduction contains all of the MRAD parts, and that is not necessary, I like it because it is very easy to tell what they are talking about, and because it fulfills the main thing that we need to have happen in the introduction, which is what is the research question and why do we care? So I think this introduction does a good job of meeting this criteria. Now let's look at the related work section. So related work, in the GCC, we refer to this as the literature review section. And as the materials you've read indicate, it goes by lots of names. It could be review of research, background, literature review, all of these things. We just picked literature review. So they have defined their related work or literature into two key areas, corpora and metrics. Now, we're going to look at this section in detail. Here, they begin by characterizing the state of the research. And they're defining throughout this section, moving back and forth between status quo and gap, and then moving to fill the gap. So we see right here a clear statement of status quo, and notice how the topic sentence is characterizing multiple studies here. So they use corpora collected from various security leaks. These corpora tend to be large, so we're explaining a little bit more about this, this body of research, and then we move into gaps. While this approach has many benefits, they come with no contextual information. The lists are difficult to verify, and they have come from low value passwords. Then they talk about an alternative. Maybe they have done it with encrypted, but so again, explaining a status quo, but here is a gap with that. So next we move into another different way of collecting the data here. Notice again, a nice strong topic sentence here so that we could kind of connect. If we just read the topic sentences, we know that some researchers collect passwords from security leaks, other researchers use lab studies. So they're sort of dividing up the field and explaining the pros and cons of these different approaches. In explaining the pros and cons of the status quo. And so they go into more detail on the status quo and also pointing out gaps, such as some of the studies are small and focus on target populations. Then the other online studies exist, but they have some problems. They might be associated with a low value account, or maybe they are passwords from accounts tied to a class. Then they start signaling to filling the gap right here. In contrast to these studies, the passwords used in our paper are for high value accounts. So they're using this literature review to move towards their study, towards the specific gap that they are filling. Next paragraph follows the same pattern. With this time self-reported password information. So again, defining a status quo, and we can connect this topic sentence to the other topic sentences to get sort of a sense of the field, what has been done, to get a sense of the status quo. Again, they point out gaps. Now, here we start moving closer to the specific gap that they are going to fill. And I know that this is the case because of the word finally, so that suggests we're moving to the end, and that they're narrowing down to a smaller number of researchers. So if we look at the beginning of this section, we see that they're going very quickly through lots of studies. 6 studies discussed in this one paragraph. I think actually more if you read through the entire paragraph. Then a smaller number of studies in the next one. And then here in this paragraph, as they get closer to the actual gap that they are going to fill, this is the first time that we've mentioned a specific study by name and looked at the details of just one study as opposed to grouping studies. So the lit review, in the sense of slowed down, at the beginning it moved very fast, grouping large numbers of studies together. And as we get closer to the end of the lit review, we're signaling out particular studies. So Florencio and Hurley did this, Banu did this, then explains what's good, and then what the gap is, and then they're filling the gap here. In contrast, our paper connects information about each user. Then they move to a study that is most closest to the work, and I know this because they have used this very clear language, and because they are now spending multiple sentences describing this particular study. As we get closer to the specific gap that the study we're working on fills, we spend more and more time with the research that is most directly related to ours and explaining the status quo and what exactly is the issue with this particular study. So when writers are working on a literature review, a good way to think about it is, what is the study that you are most directly building on? Structure the literature review so that will come last, and explain the gaps with that, and then go into fill the gap with your study here. So I'm going to show you a color-coded version of this. So status quo language is in blue, gap language is in green, and fill the gap I just left in white here. So we see how this section moves from talking about status quo and gap to ending the section with fill the gap. Then the next related work section, we move through the same thing. We repeat the process over again. Status quo and gap together, and then moving to filling the gap. And so this is an example of a well-written literature review that moves us to the study that this paper is addressing.